Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Thursday, November the 27th, 2025, Thanksgiving Day, the day in the United States at least, where we're supposed to be thankful. So today we're talking thanks and we're talking a big subject, capitalism, a global history by Sven Beckert, a Harvard University historian. The book is getting great reviews and Sven is about to cook his turkey, but he's joining us before he goes into the kitchen. Sven, happy Thanksgiving. A simple question to begin. Should we be thankful for capitalism in the Beckert living room or dining room? Are you going to say thanks for capitalism?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you so much for having me on your show. And happy Thanksgiving. Look, everything about the world we live in today is in some ways related to the advent of capitalism, the expansion of capitalism, the capitalist revolution. And certainly a lot of good came from that. We live in a world of much greater prosperity. We produce much more. We live longer lives. Many of us are much taller because we have access to better nutrition. So yes, there is a lot to be thankful for. We live at a time when we are able to produce more than ever before in human history. The degree to which our ability to produce things is accelerating at an enormous speed. So yes, we can be thankful for living in a world that has escaped some of the scarcities that have characterized almost all of human history. This is not to say though that we don't face any problems. We do have a large number of very serious problems that we're confronting. And certainly it's also the case that in the long history of capitalism, which the book charts, a 1,000-year history that I'm looking at, there are many, who have suffered greatly under the expansion of capitalism. And there are certainly many in the world today who do not benefit from the capitalist revolution.
So let me be academic for a moment. Sven, the New Yorker ran a long review of the book, and it leads with the title, "What does capitalism really mean anyway?" So what does it mean, Sven? You've spent 8 years on this book. You've written an 1,100-page book. It's quite an achievement. What exactly does it mean?
So capitalism, to me, is a particular logic to economic life. Capitalism is not all economic life in human history, just the opposite. I think capitalism is a significant departure from different and previous forms of the organization of economic life. And it is now, today, it has become so prevalent and so dominant, especially in a country like the United States, that it's sometimes hard to see because we take it to be the kind of natural order of things. But capitalism is not natural. Capitalism is historical. It has a history. We can trace how it began, and we can trace how it spread over time and how we got to the point where we are right now. Capitalism is also characterized by great variety, by great diversity. So if we look at the capitalism of the 16th century and compare that with the capitalism of the 19th century and compare that again with the capitalism of the 21st century, we see that this is all capitalism, but it's quite drastically different as well. And we also see, if we look at one particular moment in time, let's say the year 2025, we see all kinds of different forms of capitalism around the planet. The United States is very different from Cambodia. Brazil, let's say, works very differently from Russia, even though these are all capitalist societies. So what is it that holds all of that together? What makes all of that to be part of one history, namely the history of capitalism? And here we come to the definition of capitalism that you also just put on screen.
Yeah, this is the Wikipedia, not the Sven.
Okay, so I haven't read that, so who knows what that says.
Well, I'm going to quote it. It says on the first...
Capitalism is a form of the organization of economic life in which there is privately owned capital that is productively invested in order to generate more capital. That, to me, is kind of the fundamental dynamic and the fundamental logic of capitalism. Of course, this goes along with many other things as well, but in all of these different kinds of capitalism that we have discussed already, and considering all the diversity of capitalism at any particular moment in time, we can find that logic at work throughout the time of capitalism and throughout the word, which is capitalist.
So the Wikipedia definition, and I'm quoting here from the first sentence, capitalism is an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production and their use for the purpose of obtaining profit. Can one, Sven, be interested in profit as a shopkeeper, as a trader of one kind or another, and there's always been trade throughout world history, and not be a capitalist?
Yes, so that's an excellent question, and I think, as far as I know, as far as I think we know, in all human societies, there has been a trade. People have exchanged things that they have produced with one another, and there also have been markets. So this is not, as such, the defining characteristic of capitalism. The markets and trade have existed in all human societies, and but they have been rather at the margins of economic life. So I think there were two dominant logics to economic life in the world outside of capitalism. The one is kind of what I call the tributary logic. These are kind of the feudal lords of Europe, for example, that you can think of, who were born to be a feudal lord, and they came to rule over peasants who were born to be serfs and who were born to serve the lord. And the lord acquired wealth from the peasant, but the lord acquired that wealth largely by extra economic means, basically by forcing the peasants to part with some of their surplus. And that is a world in which there is, a degree of economic growth, not much, but the degree of economic growth. This is also a world in which there's a degree of technical innovation, though again, not very much, but it's a world that is distinctly not capitalist. It does not follow the capitalist logic. So this is one kind of logic outside of capitalism. And then you see also in much of the world, and even into the 20th century, you see another logic at work, and this is families securing their own subsistence and maybe securing the subsistence of their neighbors or their extended family, or maybe even the village that they're part of, or the community that they're part of. And again, here those subsistence farmers also engage in exchange. They also engage in markets to some degree, but this market-oriented behavior is really quite marginal to economic life. And so these are kind of logics of economic life that are different from the logic of capitalism, but it's out of these logics that capitalism historically emerges, and that's the story that the book tries to tell, not just by a kind of macro view or a heavily theoretical view of capitalism, but by telling the story, by actually telling the history, by telling the narrative of the emergence and the spread of capitalism, and to do this through, sometimes very local histories of particular places, particular cities, particular companies, or particular sets of people.
So where do we begin, Sven, in this global history of capitalism? Do we begin with a religious transformation? Do we begin with a technological revolution? Do we begin with a rethinking of money? Do we begin with the history of colonialization? There have been so much written. I mean, you don't need me to tell you this. You've probably read most of the books. Is there a big bang in terms of a global history of capitalism, or is that the wrong question, the wrong way of thinking about it?
I think in some ways that is the wrong question. There is not, if you think about the origins of capitalism, I don't think you can find a particular place, let's say a city, and you can certainly not have a date for the emergence of capitalism. Capitalism doesn't have a birthday, that would be very precise, that we could.
So there's no Thanksgiving for capitalism.
No, there's no birthday celebrations for Thanksgiving. But so I think in some ways, the way how capitalism emerges, it's a logic that is relatively widespread in many areas of the world in the first half of the second millennium, so in the years between 1000 and 1500. But it is a logic, so it's widespread, but it's also quite marginal to economic life on planet Earth. And to me, this logic was first personified, or the people on planet Earth who first organized the economic lives around this logic were merchants, were traders, because what they did is they purchased things and then they tried to sell them at a profit. And this is kind of the fundamental characteristic of what capitalism is about. These people, again, were quite marginal to economic life on Earth, but they existed in many different regions of the world. So my book, for example, starts in the most unlikely place, namely it starts in the port of Aden in modern-day Yemen in the year 1150, and I talk about these merchants in this town, in this city, who traded with the west coast of India. They traded with merchants on the east coast of Africa. They traded into merchant communities in northern Africa and also all the way to Europe. And this is not because I would want to argue that capitalism emerged in Aden in the year 1150, but this is just to exemplify how they organized the economic life, what they engaged with. And then I report that these kinds of communities are to be found in many different regions of the world. You can find them in China, you can find them in India, you can find them in East and West Africa. You can, of course, also find them on the continent of Europe. So there was nothing unique about this particular community, but it shows that somehow this logic that is at the core of capitalism emerged in very many different parts of the world. And then, of course, the question is how this logic that at this point only structures the lives of small communities who are, again, at the margins of economic life, how this logic came to transform and create a world in which almost everything we do, all the relationships we embedded in today, are structured by this logic. And this is a really radical story. This is a story of the most impactful revolution that has ever hit humanity. This is a total transformation of life on planet Earth. And the book basically is, going from this moment in 1150 when merchant communities and the logic of capital were quite marginal, is to go to the moment where it is when it is dominating almost everything in the world, such as today, and tries to explain, how did we get from the one point to the next?
So if it was once marginal, and you noted it began somewhere between 1000 and 1500, a period of deep religiosity controlled by the church, certainly in the West, was there a rebellious quality to these communities, whether they were in Amsterdam or other ports or Aden or in China? Were the early capitalists all rebels of one kind or another, marginal characters? Capitalism is often associated with transient communities of different peoples, Jewish people particularly, Greeks, many people who have settled all over the place. Was it, by definition, you've noted that it was a radical moment in human history, perhaps the most radical moment. Was it pioneered radically? Was it a dangerous thing to be a capitalist in 1200 or 1300?
I mean, it could be. It could be. There were certainly, if you look at a variety of religious traditions, you see that there was great opposition to the logic that these merchants represented. The Catholic Church famously thought very poorly about merchants. In, I think, all the words in Confucianism, we see that merchants, traders, are considered to be kind of the lowest of the lowest order within society, even below the peasants. So this logic, partly because it was so radical, it did generate enormous opposition, and it generated opposition both from commoners who wanted to preserve their way of life and were not eager to part with that form of life in order to embrace something radically different. But it also engendered a lot of opposition from elites. We already talked about the church, but also feudal rulers were not necessarily eager to share access to the surplus that farmers produced, the peasants produced, with these upstart capitalists. And obviously these merchants adjusted to the political environment in which they were. They adjusted to the pressures that were put upon them, but they often found displeasure among rulers, and they were expelled or even they encountered an enormous degree of resistance and opposition, which is, I think, one of the reasons of why that capitalist revolution, even though it was so enormously impactful, unfolded at the beginning rather slowly. It took many, many centuries for it to really come to beam into economic life on planet Earth in general.
What's your take, Sven, on the thesis? I want to come to Marx later, perhaps capitalism's greatest or certainly most controversial critic. But the Weber analysis, I'm not sure if it's a critique in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Do you think that Weber was onto something, or is that the wrong way of thinking about, if you like, the mentality of capitalism, thinking about it in psycho-religious terms?
Obviously, Max Weber, just like Marx or Adam Smith, are some of the most important thinkers who have tried to come to terms with this capitalist civilization. And I think just like Smith and just like Marx, Weber is writing at a moment in the history of capitalism in which Europe was clearly the dominant force. And this, I think, is also very much reflected in his way of thinking about capitalism. I mean, Weber did write about other parts of the world, but in general, he tried to explain the kind of divergence, namely why Europe came to play such an important role in the history of capitalism at the moment in which he lived, or in the century before that. I think, to be perfectly honest, I don't think we can explain that divergence from a kind of an emphasis on the importance of Protestantism, because as we already discussed, much of the logic that is at the core of capitalism emerged way before the Reformation, so before there was something called Protestantism. Even if you just look at the continent of Europe, you will immediately see that the city-states of Italy played a significant role in the European history of capitalism, and those city-states, of course, were not Protestant, because this is all way before the Protestant Reformation. And then you see also, I mean, we started in the Arab world. We looked at communities of merchants in China, and we can also look at communities of merchants, for example, in India. And so you see that under a whole diversity of religious beliefs, this capitalist logic began to emerge. And it sometimes also helps if you look at the world today. When Max Weber looked at the world, let's say in 1900, he saw a world in which Europe was unquestionably the most dominant economic power. If we look at the world today, unquestionably, Europe is not the dominant economic power, and we see that there are a lot of very gifted entrepreneurs to be found in all regions of the world, of all religious proclivities. So the book in the end doesn't put much emphasis on the role of religion in the history of capitalism, except to show that all of the world's religions had a kind of resistance against the capitalist logic at the moment of its emergence, and that this was actually one of the reasons of why that logic spread relatively slowly in economic life on planet Earth.
So let's come to Marx. Of course, as I said earlier, certainly the most controversial critic of capitalism. In the way that you go about telling the global history of capitalism, do you borrow at least a kind of Hegelian historiographical narrative? Do you share Marx's idea of capitalism being this driving force of world history? From what you've said earlier, it sounds as if you do, although you might not quite share his materialist or dialectical view of history.
Look, I think Marx is, along with Adam Smith and Max Weber, whom we already discussed, is one of the most perceptive observers of capitalism. And I think Marx saw the kind of enormous dynamic within capitalism and the enormous power of capitalism more clearly than many of his contemporaries. I think Marx has a certain how shall I put this, as a kind of teleological perspective on the development of history, which I don't embrace. And Marx also, I think, just like Adam Smith and Max Weber, writes about the history of capitalism at a particular historical moment. And that's also how he's featured in the book. He appears in the book at the moment when he writes his works in the mid-19th century. And thus he writes about, again, a particular kind of capitalism that was dominant in the parts of the world in which he lived, namely in Germany and France and the United Kingdom. And this analysis is certainly very perceptive, but it's in some ways it cannot and does not anticipate the kinds of transformations that capitalism would go through in the next 175 years. Capitalism now looks very different to what it looked like in Marx's times, and also Marx, like almost all European thinkers of his age, is somewhat limited by his European-centric perspective on the history of capitalism. I mean, he is aware of things happening elsewhere, but in the end, he is not that knowledgeable about things he's not that knowledgeable about the economic history of India, let's say, or the economic history.
Yeah, I mean, he's got all this stuff on what Asiatic production, yes. Which
also I think that is truly limited, this perspective, and it's so if we look at capitalism today, we can appreciate many of the insights of people like Adam Smith or Karl Marx or Max Weber, but I don't think we should seek to kind of just update them or somehow illustrate them. I think we need to come to a kind of different understanding of capitalism's history, of course, taking into account all the very insightful things that previous thinkers have written about. But we need to come to our own understanding of capitalism, and of course, we will come to our understanding of capitalism and its history from a very particular vantage point, again, namely from a totally globalized capitalism that has shifted its shape really drastically since the 1780s when Smith wrote, since the 1860s when Marx wrote, and since the 1900s when Max Weber wrote.
You've written a number of other highly, very well-received books, particularly on the relationship, the nature of American capitalism and its relationship with slavery. You wrote one book back in 2016 called Slavery is Capitalism, A New History. How bound up is capitalism, Sven, in the history of American slavery? After all, when you're a slave, you're not formally, at least, part of the capitalist system. You don't own your own labor. Marx wrote extensively about that. Many others have. Is, in terms of your narrative, the global history of capitalism, is there something perhaps inevitable or at least unavoidable or logical about the way in which slavery became central, at least in early American capitalism?
Look, I find it always hard to say that something was unavoidable or that history couldn't have unfolded in any other way. That in the end, we can't answer that question because history unfolded in a particular way. And what I'm trying to do is to understand the history that actually unfolded. I'm trying to understand what I call in the book really existing capitalism, and not the kind of imaginary capitalism of what it could have been if history would have only followed the law.
Well, let me then revise the question. And again, excuse the vulgarity of this. Many people think of the American Civil War between the northern capitalists and the slave owners of the South, who were somehow against capitalism, even if they were part of a global capitalist system. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
No, I totally disagree with that. I think at a certain moment in the history of capitalism, slavery was one of the most important ways of how labor was commodified, that is, was brought onto markets. And it was one of the most important ways how the production for markets was organized. This is a particular moment in the history of capitalism. And I think this moment begins in the late 15th century, and it begins with sugar agriculture on islands off the coast of Africa. It then is transferred to the Caribbean, to Brazil, and then also, of course, to what later became the United States. And it is important for a particular moment in time. It obviously, by the end of the 19th century, plantation slavery is of no importance anymore to the global history of capitalism. So we need to be careful. We need to historicize that too. We shouldn't, we cannot possibly generalize about this for the entire history of capitalism. And clearly, capitalism can thrive and expand rapidly without the institution of slavery, and has historically expanded rapidly without the institution of slavery. But at a certain moment in time, slavery was really quite important, and it was even still important when capitalism took on its modern industrial form, namely during the Industrial Revolution, which was one of the most important events in human history. And this Industrial Revolution, as you know, was focused on greater productivity in the production of cotton textiles. And of course, the cotton that was used to produce these textiles was produced largely by the 19th century in the American South, and it was largely produced by enslaved workers. So even here, in this relatively late moment in the history of capitalism, if we look at its entire history, in this relatively late moment in its industrial phase, slavery still was quite important. And I think, because you started out with Marx, again, yes, you're absolutely right that Marx has made these kinds of arguments that you just summarized. But again, that's another way that I think, I would disagree with him, because I think capitalism is not characterized only by the existence of wage labor, but is actually characterized by a whole variety of systems of labor that range, from wage labor, of course, which is now clearly the dominant system of labor under capitalism, but it ranges all the way to slavery. These are all forms of commodified labor that is exchanged on markets in one way or another.
You've used that word commodified several times, Sven. Marx, of course, wrote a book, Das Kapital, about the commodification, not just of economics, but of life itself. What does the word mean, and why is it so central in your definition, and perhaps other people, certainly Marx's definition of what capitalism actually is?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. You put on the capitalism definition that you found in Wikipedia, which I had not seen before, but it was actually quite close to what I had also just said. And obviously, for capital to be productively invested, the entrepreneur needs to be able to purchase the things she or he needs in order to organize production. So this is labor, this is land, this is factory buildings, this is raw materials. And on the other side, there must be, to make that capital productive and to make it profitable, there needs to be a market where these things can be sold. So outputs need to be sold on markets. And so what this means is that both inputs and outputs need to be made into commodities. They need to be things that can be sold and purchased on markets. And so that is how I think the capitalist revolution in some ways becomes most visible, that we can trace, we can observe in historical time, we can observe how things are made into things that can be exchanged on markets.
Things are given value. There, essentially everything becomes, and Marx wrote about this so famously in the Communist Manifesto, everything acquires value. Is that the right way of thinking of it?
Yeah, just think, about something as basic as food. In most of human history, most people grew the food that they needed for their own subsistence. And of course, that production never entered any form of markets. It was not bought and was not sold. But as part of this capitalist revolution, increasingly food is being what we call commodified, is something that people acquire on markets, and that producers also sell on markets. And this is a radical change in human history. I mean, maybe even your grandparents still grew some of their own food that they ate. That would have been very common in many, many different parts of the world. And in some parts of the world, people still grow their own food. So the fact that now in a society like the United States, almost all food is sold and bought on markets is really a radical transformation.
Yeah, and of course, I'm sure even you had time to go to the supermarket for your Thanksgiving dinner. You've mentioned a couple of times, Sven, as a good historian, that all analysts, whether it's Marx or Weber or Adam Smith, we're all limited by our historical perspective. Our views of the world are always reflected in the nature of things. Your book is very substantial. Thomas Piketty has already suggested it's a monumental book. People are arguing that it's going to perhaps win a Pulitzer Prize, which I hope it does. But in 100 years, when people look back at your book and see you perhaps as a critic or an observer of capitalism, what kind of limitations or what kind of world are you reacting to? If Marx was subjected to history, if Weber was subjected to history, then Sven Beckert is also subjected to history.
Yes, absolutely, and that's how it should be, and I hope that future scholars will see it in exactly that way. And I think if I ask myself, so how is my contemporary position influencing my thinking about capitalism? I think the most important influence really is to be living in a hyper globalized world. That is something that I think most observers of capitalism in the past did not biographically experience in the same way. And clearly my thinking about capitalism is that I researched the book in all corners of the world. I debated many of the themes in the book with scholars from all corners of the world. We are part of a kind of global conversation, not just by meeting, but also by email or by Zoom or by having conversations such as this that are increasingly global. And then, of course, also just the basic fact that economic life on Earth now is clearly not the dynamic of it is not limited to the continent of Europe, but that, for example, Asia has come to play an enormously important role in the history of capitalism. So I think that is, biographically speaking, what influenced me the most. And look, I think in the future, partly because we have been so convinced that the history of capitalism is largely a history about Europe, we have also scholars have focused their research very much on the continent of Europe. So, for example, we have literally hundreds of books, maybe an entire library full of books on the merchants of Florence, because somehow we convinced ourselves that Florence is a really important location for studying the history of capitalism. And this is certainly not wrong. I completely agree with that. But we don't have libraries full of books that study the merchants of Western Africa, for example, or the merchants of India or even the merchants of China. We still are beginning to learn about these things. We discover new things every day. Scholars increasingly are focusing on these kinds of questions. And my expectation would be that 100 years from now, we will just know so much more, not just because we have 100 years more of history and we will kind of know how things turned out, that we are facing right now, but also because we will develop, I think, a much more sophisticated understanding of parts of the history of parts of the world and the commercial, the economic history of parts of the world that have not yet been subjected to the same kind of scholarly scrutiny that some parts of Europe have been subjected to.
You wrote an interesting op-ed, New York Times, earlier this month. The old order is dead. Do not resuscitate. You talk about the crisis of neoliberalism. We've had your friend Gary Gerstle, the author of another wonderful book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, on the show a number of times. Is neoliberalism, in your view, you seem to be suggesting this, is it dead? And what does that tell us about capitalism? Is it in crisis, or is it just unfolding a new chapter? How might studying, I don't know, capitalists in China or West Africa, how is that going to help us understand the future of capitalism?
Yeah, so, obviously the future is uncertain, and I'm the last one who feels ready to predict what's going to come next. I just think that, looking at the past and looking at the long history of capitalism allows us to see certain patterns and allows us to ask certain questions also about the present that might help us, think productively about the future. And one thing that comes out of my thinking about the long history of capitalism is that change in capitalism in some ways is continuous, right? Every year we produce more things, we consume more things, more people, enter, let's say, factories to work in factories. So this is a kind of continuous process of change within capitalism. But then there's also discontinuous change in capitalism. There's certain kinds of institutional framework at certain points in time that is quite stable for a long moment, but then can also shift quite radically. So, for example, the Keynesian economic order of the 1950s and 1960s, the New Deal order, as Gary Gerstle calls it, that order was quite fundamentally different from the neoliberal order of the 1990s and 2000s. And so I identify in the book, maybe 6 different such institutional orders, and one of these institutional orders is neoliberalism. And if we think about other moments in history when these institutional orders came into crisis, we see a certain pattern. We see that these institutional orders experience forms of economic crisis, and we can observe that when we look at the neoliberal order by reminding ourselves of the severity of the crisis of 2008, 2009. But we also see that these institutional orders create certain resistances. People oppose these orders, and we can see that again. If we look at the neoliberal order, we see these resistances coming from the left. Just think about Occupy Wall Street and the movement against the WTO. But we can also see that when we look at, especially we can see that now when we look at political movements from the right, with the rise of the populist nationalism in the United States, but also in many different parts of the world. So my general sense, again, I'm not predicting the future here, but my general sense is that we are in one of these moments now of institutional transition and a kind of rapid change within capitalism, that a different kind of capitalism is emerging at the present moment. And, I don't think it's totally settled what this is going to be. I think there is a kind of openness to history, and there's an openness to the future that we should remind ourselves and appreciate. Of course, the historian 30, 40, 50 years from now will identify a certain kind of logic to the transition we are living in right now, and will clearly be able to identify what this new order is all about. But I think for us, it would be a little bit premature to come to these conclusions. But I think we are in one of these moments of what I call regime transition.
Sven, Mrs. Thatcher, of course, Margaret Thatcher, one of the great advocates of capitalism, famously said, there is no alternative. A lot of people have been thinking about alternatives. If indeed capitalism is to us like water is to a fish, how do we imagine an alternative to capitalism? Of course, Lenin, Marx all imagined alternatives which didn't work out particularly well. What does your book tell us, this global history of capitalism? It's not like John Cassidy, who was on the show a few months ago. It's not a book about capitalism and its critics, but of course, by definition, in studying capitalism, you're also studying its critics. What does it tell us about alternatives to capitalism? Because more and more people are trying to figure out alternatives, whether they're on the radical left or right.
Right. So there are, throughout the history of capitalism, there have been many critics of capitalism, and you have discussed that in detail already on the show. There have also been many people for a long time, for almost 200 years, who have predicted the imminent end of capitalism. And if you go into bookstores today, you see also plenty of writings that predict the almost imminent end of capitalism. And I'm generally not entirely convinced by the logic of these arguments because as I said, the end of capitalism has been predicted many times, and much of the history that I'm writing about, the history of capitalism, came after the prediction of capitalism's imminent end. And so I think there is a fair amount of life left in capitalism. But what I can also say is that one of the core arguments of the book is to show how radical a departure from previous forms of economic life capitalism is, that it is historical, that we can trace its emergence, we can trace its spread. And of course, as far as we know, anything that is historical has not just in the beginning, but also has an end. What the world will be, what the world will look like in the far future, that is to me completely unclear. Obviously, we have many people who think about that, and we certainly have some ideas of the kinds of issues that this world perhaps should deal with and think about. Among them, the enormous environmental problems that we face, and also the enormous social inequality that we face. But the book engages in no prediction what this world is going to look like, and I don't think this can be predicted. I'm focusing on the history. I'm trying to explain how we got to where we are right now, which in itself is quite difficult. And I leave thinking about the future to others. But we can also see, and maybe that's how I should end my answer. We can see in capitalism that there's a whole variety of capitalisms, and the form of capitalism that predominated, for example, in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, was quite fundamentally different from the capitalism in which we are living in right now. So there are also different regimes within capitalism.
Well, let me be a little more specific in that question. It seems like there are, well, as you say, just as there's lots of capitalisms, there's lots of different critics of capitalism. But one way of thinking of an alternative to capitalism is to look back historically and say, okay, what existed before capitalism? Maybe we need to go back there, back to what Marx would have called, I don't know, the primitive village. But there are also people, maybe even some of the people in the abundance movement, who could imagine a world in which modern technology, digital technology, network technology, AI might be able to offer an alternative to capitalism. Are either of those ways of thinking about alternatives to capitalism helpful, do you think, Sven?
I think the first one is completely unhelpful. I don't think
that's the kind of Rousseau school of going.
I don't think there's anything particularly desirable in living in a world of great scarcity and massive social inequalities too, and massive forms of exploitation by the lord of the peasants. No, I don't think that. And history also doesn't repeat. I mean, it's not like that we have the choice to return to some imaginary or also real past. That is just completely impossible and also not particularly desirable. Yes, I think the capitalist revolution has brought with it enormous gains in productivity, and it continues to bring about enormous gains in our ability to produce things and to provide things. And this makes possible a different way of thinking about how we organize our economic life. For example, we can, if the artificial intelligence revolution is going to bring with it massive improvements in human productivity, which I think is uncertain, but at least some people argue for it, and that sounds to me also plausible. But so then we have two ways of dealing with that. We can say, okay, the gains will be going to a very small group of very wealthy people who are now crucially involved in creating that kind of new technology. Or we can say, we'll use these productivity gains, for example, that all of us work fewer hours each week, or we'll be paying people who don't get paid particularly well better in the future, or we provide them with better access to education or other such things. So there are a lot of political choices to be made.
But what should those political choices be? The New York Times review of your book, everyone loves the book, suggested that it was in part a moral indictment of capitalism. The New Yorker suggested that you were lamenting capitalism. So you clearly believe that we need to, if not rethink capitalism, rethink some of its essences. As an ending to this conversation, Sven, how would you like people to begin to rethink capitalism?
I think I would like people to learn from that history that we are not just the pawns in the working out of an economic logic, but that we ourselves create the world, the economic world in which we live, and that we have choices. We can organize this world in a variety of ways. And if you ask me what I think is, particularly urgent at this particular moment in time, not least also for political reasons, is that the kind of the levels of social inequality in a place like the United States, but also elsewhere, have reached a degree that I think is almost incomprehensible. It's kind of an absurd level of social inequality, and we, my book suggests, and we know this is true. We have the material basis to solve most of the most urgent social problems in our society. We can feed everybody, we can clothe everybody, we can provide everybody with decent education, we can provide everybody with excellent healthcare. That's a great privilege. That was not the case in much of human history, but now we have these possibilities. And in some ways, there are political decisions to be made. And we also know some of the tools of how that kind of broad-based prosperity can be generated. That's the first one. And the second one is, of course, what you see when you deal with the long history of capitalism. You see that this expansionary dynamic of capitalism that we discussed at the very beginning when we thought about how to define capitalism, that this dynamic in some ways is coming into conflict with another dynamic, namely the dynamic of nature, which is as such is limited. There's only so much fossil fuel to be pumped out of the ground, and there is only so much plastic you can dump into the world's oceans. So there is a kind of tension here, and I think just in the interest of future generations, we need to pay much, much greater attention to that. But we have the means to do so, and we should, in that way, I think the book in some ways ends on an optimistic note, because I feel we have the ability to solve these problems. We just need to find the political will and the political ability to do so.
Well, there you have it. A major new book. It's out this week. Capitalism, A Global History. 1,100 pages, 8 years in your research and writing. Congratulations, Sven, on the book. And best of luck with your cooking today. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving, and thank you so much for having me on the show.